My portion of the presentation deals with our suggested course of action on dealing with the problems of late delivery of key milestone materials. The subjects I'm going to cover are a new method for predicting needs, the background of the problem of materials, the advantages of new methods, and the primary characteristics of the problem itself.
How's the preparation for your speech going?
Haven't even thought about it yet.
Aren't you giving that thing next Monday?
Sure, but what's there to prepare? I've done it 100 times before. It's a piece of cake. Look, all I do is whip out a little small sketchy outline and I can go on for 30, 40 minutes. I could do this speech in my sleep.
My portion of the presentation will deal with the procedures for making the infiltration and inflow analysis. I will briefly review each step involved in that process in order to give you a clearer picture of the methodology used. The 10 basic points I'll be reviewing are review of maps and records, patterned interviews, NWCC wastewater flow charts, water consumption records, meteorological data, topographical data, soil and groundwater data, system age, city ordinances, and drainage information. Now, let's take a look at a review of maps and records.
These are the kinds of errors that are relatively common when you find a speaker who has not taken the time to deliberately design a presentation, but has just kind of allowed it to happen. And it inevitably runs into the problem of breaking down the relationship that exists between the speaker and the audience, primarily due to a badly designed presentation. Now that you know who you're going to give your presentation to, that is, we've got our audience analysis down, now we can start looking at actually designing the presentation itself. And before we talk about the specifics of how to do it, it's important that you recognize in advance that there are two constraints that are going to work against you at all times in making a technical presentation: time and complexity. Time in the sense that no audience is going to say to you, look, we'll give you all the time you want. Just talk about whatever you feel like talking about. Now, they always give you some kind of limitation. It may be a 15-minute limitation, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, whatever it is. Somewhere along the line, the audience says, you begin here, you end there, you conform to that time constraint. And I've talked to a lot of people over the years, and one response you always get is that it's never enough time to cover it in the kind of detail that a technical expert is comfortable with. You always want a little more time than you've got. Now, the complexity constraint, I want to remind you again, relates to how easy it is to fall into the trap of assuming that just because something is clear to you, that it's going to be clear to the audience. Your technical areas of specialization are familiar to you because you work with them day after day, hour after hour. Ultimately, the stuff becomes simple. It's very clear and understandable. But you cannot assume that even a knowledgeable audience is going to be as aware as you are of kind of the detail of what you're working with. Remember, you're always leading an audience from a level of ignorance to a level of knowledge. So that when we talk about constraints of time and complexity, it means that you're going to have to carefully design your presentation to fit the needs of the time and to fit the capability of the audience. Now, how do you do that? I think that the concept begins with recognizing the difference between a topical area, if you will, and topics for a presentation. Topical area is kind of the general area in which you are an expert. If someone were to say to you, look, how many main ideas could you develop if there were no constraints of time and complexity? Well, you could make an endless list of them. Your problem is to take a list, for instance, and reduce it down to a limited number of main ideas. Now, There's a technique associated with this that I'd like you to get familiar with and comfortable with. It's a very simple one. Start out, piece of paper and a pencil, write down or list all of the main ideas that you could develop for the audience that you've already determined. Now remember, there's already some limitation taking place there. Once you know the audience, now list all that you could talk about. And by the way, keep the list simple. Don't write out full sentences or develop outlines or anything like this. Write down a couple of words and look at the couple of words as you go along. Now, when your list is complete, you begin the process of evaluation. Now, to evaluate the topics is not in terms of good, better, or best, but which ones are necessary for that audience at that time. And once in a while, you're just going to have to take some of them out. You say, look, they don't need to know this. That's beyond their concern. We'll handle that later. Start scratching them out. Now, you still may end up, after the selection process is over, with too many main ideas, and they may have to combine some of them together. Now, I keep talking about the right number of main ideas, a limited number of main ideas, too many main ideas. I think we better start talking numbers pretty soon. And I'll give you an example of how complex a presentation can get. Several years back, one of the computer corporations asked me to assist a bunch of people who were putting together a very, very critical presentation for the United States Navy. Now, I don't know the details of this thing anymore. It's been a long time, but I walked into that group and I sat down with them. I said, all right, what seems to be the problem? They said, well, the first problem is that this presentation has 33 main points. I said, come on, level with me. We haven't got time for all this. They said, no, we're serious. I said, wow. I said, tell me about it. Now, I don't know the details of this whole thing, but what it was is it's a computerized armament system to be placed on board a Navy vessel, all right? Now, what happened was there were a number of steps involved in gathering sensory data about the location, trajectory, velocity, probable course of action of some unidentified flying or floating object. That sensory data was fed into a computer system, all right, that determined what possible courses of action could be taken to deal with the object, all right? On the basis of known data, that information was fed into another computer that made a decision about which course of action would be the best one to take at that moment. The decision was fed through computers into the armament system that initiated the action called for, and then there were a few steps that were called confirming the kill or looking for the grease spot. Now, how many main ideas in that presentation? 5, not 33. Now, there were 33 discrete steps involved associated with the first sighting down to the confirmation of kill, but the main ideas were more limited. I say, well, what difference does it make? I covered the same amount of ground, by the way. The presentation still covered the 33 steps that were involved. The difference comes in getting your ideas into the mind of the audience. At the very beginning of this thing, we talked about measuring the effectiveness of a technical presentation by asking how much gets into their heads, not their hands. And we've actually done this, by the way. We take an audience after a technical presentation is over. We'll ask them, what did the speaker talk about? Now, if they come back and say, well, they covered 5 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they come back and feed them back to you. Now, what you've done there, you've got your main ideas fixed in the mind of that audience. If on the other hand, they say, well, covered an awful lot of ground here, let me look at what they said. That's with a handout routine. You haven't done it then. They don't have it up here, they've got it in their hand. And that isn't going to work. You've got to maintain or recognize an audience is not going to remember 33 main points. They're not going to remember 15, by the way. Matter of fact, they're not going to remember 10 of them when you're talking about their capacities to listen and to understand and remember. I think what you're stuck with is recognizing you've got about a 5-point limit, 6 if you're pushed, okay? But you've got to stay somewhere in the 5 or 6 main idea range. You know, over the years, I've seen that mistake made so many times. Engineers in particular want to cover everything that they can possibly talk about. And I think it's far more effective to limit the number of main ideas in a presentation and get them across clearly in a way in which they can be remembered than to dump everything on them and hope some of it sticks. The effectiveness of a presentation is in part going to be determined by the way in which you analyze, select, evaluate, and ultimately put together the main ideas that you want to deal with. Now, I like to take this whole process and deal with it on a more specific example and talking about the way in which it might be done if we went back to our PRT example that we used earlier. Now, the area of personal rapid transit is one that is broad enough to really constitute a wide variety of possibility in terms of the selection of topics. What I'd like to do is I'd like to just begin hypothetically with someone who is attempting to do what we said we were going to do, is to list possible topics in the area of personal rapid transit. Now, one might be starting, for instance, by saying, well, we could talk about stations and station design, that is, the offline, inline, whatever they might be. A second possibility, for instance, might be how to establish lateral stability for the cars themselves, for the vehicles. A third possibility is means of propulsion, whether we're going to use a tired vehicle or air-driven or railed or whatever it might be. Another one has to do with the drive mechanism itself. Do you use a rotary drive or a linear drive system? Another possibility is to deal with vehicle size. And then along with that, whether or not the vehicles are designed to have seated passengers only or seated and standing passengers. So you can get into that sort of thing. You can talk about the whole system of the shuttle system itself, how that's to be designed and put together. You could get into safety factors such as how do you maintain relative position stability and things like that, or position control. You could talk about what's wrong with the present mass transit system, and you could finally talk about what are the characteristics of a worthwhile alternative to the present system. Now, see, that doesn't take a great deal of effort, by the way, to list up 10 topics that you could talk about to an audience. Now, the next step, we said, was to evaluate the list of topics that you've come up with. Now, evaluate them according to what? Remember, we talked about evaluating according to the audience. Well, we got two kinds of audiences that are relatively typical when we talk about personal rapid transit. One can have what we call, might say, a general audience level, and that's the kind of people who are not technically involved in transportation, but who are involved like city government, state government, federal government, whoever it might be. That's kind of one level of audience. Then you've got a technical level of audience, and they've got a whole different kind of concern. The technical level is obviously concerned with, the workings of the whole thing. Now, if we go back, let's look at the general audience again. Out of the 10 topics that we talked about, which ones might you evaluate and select for that audience, all right? Well, for instance, vehicle size is something they'd be concerned with merely because of cost factors, if nothing else. They might be concerned about the standing versus the seating kind of thing as to how the vehicles will be designed and so on. They certainly would be involved in safety factors, so that relative position control is something they'd want to talk about. Since they're involved in the present system now, you might very well want to talk about the weaknesses of the present system. And I think rather obviously you want to talk about what are the alternatives then, or what are the characteristics of an alternative. Now, if you look at the technical audience, on the other hand, they've got some different kinds of concerns. For instance, they're more likely to be concerned with how the stations are going to be designed, whether they're online or offline stations. They're going to be very interested in, lateral stability, or establishing lateral stability on the cars. They're likely to be very involved in propulsion systems. They're going to be involved in the rotary versus the linear method of delivering power. And certainly they're going to be involved in the kind of the overall shuttle system. So you see that out of the 10 topics that we came up with, it becomes rather obvious to say that you evaluate those 10 topics according to the needs of the audience, and the audience itself is going to have an impact on which ones are ultimately selected. Now, what we've done is we've listed, we've evaluated, we've selected. Now, there's another step that's involved that is very, very critical to the clarity of the presentation, and that is to establish the order in which the topics are going to be presented. You know, I think when Aristotle first was talking about logic or logos as a means of persuasion, he obviously had in mind what we would call the formal logic of syllogisms, or what's now called Aristotelian logic. And I think the term expands well beyond that in terms of current day use. As a matter of fact, I think the term should be logics with an S on the end rather than logic singular, for no other reason than there are a lot of ways in which people reason to arrive at a conclusion. And that's really what we're gearing at. We're looking at logic as a pattern of reasoning or as a pattern of thinking. Now, I think it's important to recognize why we want to focus in on that. I think earlier we talked about all of the problems that people have as listeners. They're not very skilled at listening, and yet here we are talking about a system that is designed to communicate information primarily through the spoken word with a listening audience. Literally, you've got to do everything you can to make that message as clear and as understandable as possible. That's where organization or the patterns are critical. What we're trying to do is to find out what are the patterns by which people think. And we know that these are fairly well culturally determined and fairly well established by practice. And I think the first one is the easiest one to understand, in which we talk about what we call time order or an organizational pattern of chronology. Now, that's the one, by the way, that you probably are most familiar with in terms of the growth pattern the person goes through. You know, when you're a little child, people read you stories, right? You know, once upon a time in the middle of the great big woods. All right, well, that's a narration. And a narration is nothing more than a series of events that happen one after another. That's a standard method of organization. Now, how do you use that in making a technical presentation? Suppose, for instance, to go back to PRT for a moment, one wants to reinforce the relationship between cultural development and, again, mass transit. One might begin with, for instance, with the stagecoach, and then we evolved into the railroads. And then they had the horse-drawn carriages and cars that were in the cities. Then we went to electric streetcars, then to buses, and then here we are now at personal rapid transit. Each one of those is a step, historically, in the evolutionary process. Now, if there is a logical relationship between the points that are being made, that makes it easier for the audience to remember and to recall what it is that you said. Now, there are other kinds of patterns that I think are relatively easy to pick up on. For example, I was working recently with an engineering firm that was making an analysis of sewers, all right? And they were talking about literally a sequence of events through which they were going to go, all right? They had, first of all, what they called an infiltration and inflow analysis. That was step one. Once that's done, we have enough information to go on to the second step, the SSES, which is a sewer system evaluation survey. And then based on the information we receive from that, we can go on to the third step, which is a design for the rehabilitation of the system. And that's a sequence that you have to go through. It's kind of like a recipe. You do this, you do that, then you do that. You're all familiar with recipes. You know you have the raw ingredients, and it says you take these three things and you mix them and blend them, then you stir in, then you pour it in a pan, and you stick it in the oven, and you bake it for 30 minutes at 450 degrees. Now, if you think the sequence is not critical, by the way, try to reverse the sequence someday. Bake it all first, and then try to stir and mix it. Obviously, it isn't going to work. Now, a lot of things that have to do with testing programs, methods of analysis, all of these are sequence-related. And the critical factor of a sequence-related presentation is there is a reason why step one is step one, and then one must logically follow the two comes from that, step three follows from that, step four, and so on. So again, the sequence is well set, and that's what establishes the thinking process. Now, another very common one, by the way, is comparison and contrast. Comparison and contrast is nothing more than taking two entities and then comparing them or contrasting them according to some well-set standards. For instance, In PRT, there's a lot of controversy over whether or not one ought to have cars that run on a set schedule as opposed to what they call demand responsive systems, where the individual who wants transportation requires it, demands it, it comes for that individual. So, okay, there are the two systems. Now, a presentation could literally be designed on the basis of saying which one of the systems has the best use of peak time, which one is the most economical to operate, which one has, for instance, the best mobility for the population that's using it. At each standard or each step along the line, one can take the two and compare them back and forth. Another common one in engineering areas is what's called a spatial pattern of organization. And that really identifies what is the relationship of things in terms of space. If you deal with plant design, for instance, you start with an entity, that's where this is located. Now next to that is something else, and then in the other direction is something else, in which you literally design the plant by identifying what occupies what spaces. Very, very common, by the way, for industrial engineers to make presentations about assembly line systems. Where it starts, what's next to that, where do you move the piece to from there, what happens, you move it to here. Again, it's a spatial relationship. Now these, by the way, are very commonly referred to as informational patterns. But a lot of what you do is persuasive in nature. Now, how do you apply this to a persuasive presentation? Again, a common PRT presentation has to do with recognizing one of the critical factors in mass transit has to do with land use. Now, one begins the presentation by saying, what are the problems themselves? And then you talk about the high cost of land, the availability of land in the high concentrated areas of a downtown, and you keep identifying all of the land use problems. Then, having done that, second point of the presentation is to say, now here's a system that we can use that literally will reduce the land use problems. You say, all right, it's elevated above street level. All you need is a place for the pylons. You can talk in terms of what that system is. Now, by the way, don't stop there. You know, one of the common mistakes I see in engineering presentations is literally they say, here's the problem, here's the answer, are there any questions? Now, just because you've worked it out yourself, don't assume that the audience can automatically make the change. You tell them what the problem is, you tell them what the solution is. Your third point is to come back and say, now this is how it's going to work. And you identify the relationship between the solution that you've offered and the problem that you started with. It makes a neat package, a three-point presentation. Now, another one I see a great deal of in terms of persuasion in industry, and especially the technical presentation, is what's called the pattern of elimination. And that's the kind of thing where you go in front of an audience and say, you all know what the problem is, of course. All right? Now, we have come up with the fact that there are only 4 alternative possibilities for solving the problem. Then you say, first of all, here are the standards that we use to measure the viability of each one of the 4, and you identify what they are. Then you take alternative number 1, and you explain why it does not meet the standards and must be eliminated. Then you go on to problem number 2, explain why it does not meet standards and must be eliminated. Problem 3 is compared to standards and eliminated. Look what's left. You end up saying to your audience, hey, relax, we do have a solution. It just so happens alternative number 4 will work. Now, at this point, of course, they're going to sigh deeply and say, good, and where do I sign? Now, the only problem, by the way, that I want to caution you about in the pattern of elimination is that you make very, very sure that nobody in the audience has a 5th alternative, that is, because if they do, then you're going to be destroyed. They say, have you considered this option? You say, never occurred to us. You have done nothing. Make sure in the pattern of elimination that you have identified all of the viable alternatives. Now look, these standardized patterns, I think are ones that you can kind of pick and choose from. It's not always that clear as to exactly how to label the pattern, even though the pattern itself might become clear. Just a few moments ago, we talked about the idea that with a general audience in PRT, we came up with 5 topics. Now, the order of those topics at the point where we left it was random. And frankly, they will not work in that way. If we take a look at what those 5 points were again, we'll begin to see how you would order them so that they make sense. With a general audience again, I think the obvious and logical place to start, if you look at it, is to begin by saying, what are the problems with your current system? All right, and then you tell them what they are. Then you come back and you say, now, well, the second point is, what are the characteristics associated with a worthwhile alternative to these problems? All right? Then you can go on from there and talk about details of the system. You can say, we would use a vehicle of this size and explain why. We would use a vehicle that primarily is designed for seated only and explain why. And then finally, because obviously they're going to be interested in the safety factors, with the smaller vehicles you recommend, this is the system that we'd use to maintain relative position control. Now, that makes a logical or reasonable sequence of development. We do the same thing with the technical presentation that we kind of arbitrarily created a little while ago. If you take a look at the 5 main ideas there, they appear to have some kind of order with them. I think you'd probably begin on the basis of saying, how do you want to propel the vehicles? We'll start with the basics of the vehicle itself. Then if you establish that you want a rail vehicle, the next thing is, how do you maintain the lateral stability of the railed vehicle? The third point might very well be to talk in terms of how it's driven, because we're still talking vehicle. There you get into the rotary versus the linear method. Then I think it would be possible to go to stations, and since you want to concern how many stations and where they're located, you'd obviously move into the shuttle system itself. That then creates a logical, reasonable development of ideas. You know, the whole patterning concept is one that, frankly, is a little hard to talk about because you've got so many possibilities. But I really don't care whether you remember all of these patterns. As a matter of fact, I don't care if you have never used one of those patterns at all. What I want is very simple. Once you've got your main ideas fixed, a good way to get used to that is put them down on a little slip of paper, just a couple of words for each one, lay them out on a table, and then look at them. Then ask yourself the question, out of these number of main ideas, which one should be presented first and why? Now, if you've got an answer to that, you say this one first because. Then ask, what would logically follow from that and why? If there's a reason for number 1 to be number 1, then there's probably a reason for number 2 to be number 2. We're going to need this later on, by the way, when we talk about the flow or continuity of ideas. It's a very simple thing. Once you've laid out your main ideas, if somebody comes wandering by and says, what are you doing? You say, I'm designing a presentation. You say, oh, why are you talking about that first? You're going to have an answer. You can say, that's first because, rather than saying, well, that's the first one occurred to me, or I've always liked that one first. There's going to be something more. We're still going back to the idea, you're putting ideas in the mind of an audience. The clearer it is, the better off you are. All of this business of designing a presentation is all geared to one thing. At the end of the design, the package, the outline, whatever you want to call it, you are in a position where you can understand and appreciate the cohesiveness of it. That is, the ability of it to stick together. A lot of times I've heard good technical presentations if you're evaluating only content, but they don't go anywhere. They don't seem to have a logical beginning, a logical flow, a logical conclusion. You've got to have cohesiveness. Secondly, I think you have to have a kind of a reasonable presentation. Reasonable in the sense that it appeals to the reasoning capacity of the human being. Because that's really all we got to go on, isn't it? Their capacity to think and understand. And finally, if a presentation is well designed, the topics are well selected and well organized, what you're going to have is a memorable presentation. I don't mean memorable for thousands of years, but I mean memorable enough so it sticks up in the minds of the audience. Now, one last comment about this. The very beginning of the programs, I told you, if you recall, There is no substitute for thorough and complete preparation. Nobody likes to sit down and say, I've got to do all this organizational crap, right? It's no fun. It's not creative in the sense of being exciting. It's a routine kind of thing that has to be done. Unfortunately, it does have to be done. Organization is not something that happens by itself. Organization, clear, lucid, well-designed presentations are the product of hard work. It's the kind of preparation that you need to do in order to be prepared to face the audience when you get up there. We talked about reducing stage fright, all of those things. This is where it happens. There's no magic involved in it, by the way. Get in the habit of doing it. Select your topics, find a pattern in which to go with them, do an outline so that you've got a good handle on all of the components of it, and then you're ready to go on to the next step. And the next step, which we will discuss in our next program, is now that you know what you're going to say, how do you visualize it in order to reinforce your ideas to an audience?